He said, "That apple has to be removed or it'll touch the rest of the apples." Grabbed my hand and he gave me a kiss. This is a suspicious kiss, the kiss of death. That chilling quote, it comes directly from Joseph Valachi, and he's recalling the exact terrifying moment he realized his own boss, Vito Genovese, had marked him for murder while they were both sitting in a federal penitentiary. It's a deeply intimate, violent moment, and it actually sparked the ultimate betrayal in the underworld. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to dive into the tragic hubris that unraveled New York's most notorious criminal empires, completely from the inside out. For decades, the American Mafia operated like a ghost, literally a whispered myth that law enforcement could barely even prove existed. But as we'll see, the downfall of the five families wasn't just about relentless FBI agents or wiretaps. Actually, it was brought about by their own insatiable appetite for power, greed, and, surprisingly enough, fame. All right, Section 1, Breaking the Secret Code. So, to really understand how the Mafia fell, you first have to understand the absolute glue that held it together for its first 3 decades in America. And that glue? It's omerta. Now, this wasn't just a suggestion. It was the foundational rule of survival. We do not talk to the law. We do not talk to outsiders. All of our business is private. Breaking omerta was the absolute greatest sin a mobster could ever commit. I mean, once you were in for life. You couldn't get out, and you certainly couldn't speak. But that sacred code was completely shattered in 1963 by a low-level Genovese soldier who just felt backed into a corner. That soldier was Joseph Valachi. While he was serving time in Atlanta in 1958, Valachi grew utterly paranoid that Vito Genovese was going to have him killed. In a complete panic, Valachi actually murdered another inmate with an iron pipe, mistakenly believing the poor guy was an assassin sent by Genovese. So, now facing a murder charge and absolutely terrified for his life, Valachi did the unthinkable. He flipped. He went before the McClellan Senate Subcommittee on national television and just laid out the mob's highly structured hierarchy to the whole world. He explained that there was no longer a single boss of all bosses, but instead a ruling board called the Commission. And below them were the bosses of the individual 5 families, the underbosses, the capo regimes, and finally the soldiers at the bottom. He essentially handed the United States government the entire org chart of the American Mafia on a silver platter. And honestly, he didn't stop there. Valachi yanked back the curtain on the deepest, everyday secrets of what he called the Cosa Nostra. He revealed details that seem mundane to us, but were absolutely critical to their survival, like the code words they used to identify a made man. Think about this. If you introduced someone as a friend of ours, it meant they were a sworn member of the family. But if you just said, a friend of mine, they were an outsider, nothing more. It was incredibly thrilling for the American public to watch this on live TV and completely, utterly abhorrent for the bosses who had to sit there watching their darkest secrets spilled in broad daylight. Now, you might be wondering, why did Vito Genovese foster such a chaotic, paranoid environment in the first place? Well, it really came down to a stark contrast in leadership styles. You had Frank Costello, the quiet Don. He was a dapper, politically connected businessman who just wanted peace and quiet so he could make money in the shadows. But his underboss, Genovese, was rough around the edges, deeply envious, vicious, and very willing to shoot first to take power. This dynamic perfectly explains why Genovese orchestrated a brazen public assassination attempt on Costello in 1957. Now, Costello survived and quietly stepped down to uphold that code of omerta, but Genovese's reckless public power grab, it set a super dangerous precedent. The shadows were starting to recede. Which brings us to Section 2, the heroine temptation. So, as the rules of succession and secrecy began to fray, another massive temptation presented itself to the 5 families. It was one that would force them to break their own most fundamental rules, all for the sake of sheer profit. For years, the official rule of the American Mafia was strict. Absolutely no dealing in narcotics. But, the unofficial rule was always, make as much money as you can, any way you can. In the late 1950s, an ambitious boss named Joe Bonanno traveled to Palermo, Sicily to broker a massive drug deal. The agreement was simple, but it was devastating. The Sicilian Mafia would manufacture and smuggle cheap heroin into the U.S. The American Mafia, following Bonanno's guidance, would then distribute it into their local markets. The Americans took a huge commission for essentially doing nothing. Bonanno's greed completely broke the traditional no drugs rule, and it tragically flooded inner cities like Harlem and Brooklyn with cheap heroin. This destroyed communities and brought a whole new catastrophic level of federal heat down onto the 5 families. Let's move to Section 3, Bosses in the Spotlight. Okay, so the rules against drugs and the rules against internal public violence were totally failing. But what happened next ushered in a completely new era for the mob. That ancient need for secrecy was suddenly replaced by sheer, unchecked ego. Get this. In the early 1970s, Joe Colombo, the reputed boss of an entire New York Mafia family, actually sat down as a guest on a late-night talk show to confidently deny that the Mafia even existed. I mean, it is staggering. Colombo was furious about the intense FBI surveillance on his family, so he just completely abandoned the shadows. He formed the Italian-American Civil Rights League and used the media to loudly fight back against the government, claiming it was all just a prejudice-fueled conspiracy. He became this high-profile public figure, holding massive rallies and giving TV interviews. Unsurprisingly, that kind of public exposure had direct, bloody consequences. The breakdown of all these rules led to a rapid, chaotic succession of very public, very violent power grabs. It started with Costello back in '57, sure, but it escalated wildly. By 1971, the other bosses had grown to absolutely hate Joe Colombo's media circus. During one of his massive Civil Rights League rallies, right in front of thousands of people and news cameras, Colombo was shot 3 times in the head and paralyzed. And sadly, this public bloodletting, it just became the new normal, leading straight to the assassinations of guys like Joey Gallo and later on, Paul Castellano. And actually, speaking of Joey Gallo, his story is the ultimate cautionary tale of this era. After Colombo was shot, everybody in the underworld knew there was an open hit on Crazy Joe Gallo, a volatile mobster suspected of orchestrating the Colombo hit. But Gallo, he didn't care at all. When his own crew warned him to lay low, his response was literally, "Fuck them, they ain't got the balls to do it." Gallo had become a genuine media celebrity, hanging out in Greenwich Village with high society and actors who kind of romanticized the mob lifestyle. He felt totally untouchable. But that hubris caught up with him on his 43rd birthday in 1972. Instead of hiding out, he threw a lavish party at the Copacabana and then headed over to Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy at 4:30 in the morning. Gunmen walked right through the kitchen and assassinated him, right in front of his new wife and stepdaughter. The old rules of discretion? Yeah, they were completely dead. Section 4, Rise of the Dapper Don. So this brings us right into the 1980s and to a central conflict that took this whole love for the spotlight to a fatal, highly stylized extreme. It was a total clash of ideologies between two men who actually lived in the exact same Howard Beach neighborhood. On one side, you have John Gotti, the Dapper Don. He seized control of the Gambino family by orchestrating the unsanctioned, brazen street assassination of his boss, Paul Castellano, in 1985. Gotti loved the paparazzi, he threw lavish parties, and he completely embraced his status as a tabloid superstar. But on the other side, you had Joe Massino, the boss of the Bonanno family. Massino was strictly old school. He absolutely despised Gotti's showiness and believed deeply in operating under the radar. It was the quiet, traditional survival tactic pitted against flashy, arrogant bravado. To truly wrap your head around John Gotti's priorities, you really just need to know this one number: $1,800. That is supposedly what John Gotti spent on a single Brioni suit back in the 1980s. In fact, when reporters claimed his suits cost $1,000, Gotti supposedly got offended and corrected them. He was so obsessed with his public tabloid image that he treated the mafia more like a Hollywood vanity project than a secretive, illicit business. And it was a fatal distraction that inevitably brought the full, crushing weight of the federal government down on his family. Let's look at Section 5, the hidden mob tax. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Why does this matter to me? It's so easy to look at men in $1,000 suits shooting each other at 4 a.m. and think it's just a movie plot. But during the 80s and 90s, the mob deeply, deeply embedded themselves into the mundane, everyday infrastructure of New York City. We aren't just talking about underground gambling here. The mafia infiltrated legitimate labor unions across the board. They had a stranglehold on the garment industry, the Fulton Fish Market, window installations, and even parking lots. They were literally shaking down the very heartbeat of the city's commerce. Let's break down how this extortion functioned in practice. Take private trash removal, for example. Because the mob effectively controlled the carting unions and rigged all the bids, there was zero free market competition. If you owned a restaurant or a small business, you couldn't just shop around for a better price. You had to pay the mob-controlled price, which featured a massive 35% markup over the fair market value. So everyday New Yorkers, business owners, and eventually regular consumers were the ones footing the bill for this massive extortion racket. And the sheer scale of this, it's breathtaking. $500 million. That staggering number represents the estimated profit the mob generated just from the private garbage hauling industry alone. I mean, they were generating corporate-level wealth off the backs of everyday citizens, simply by threatening violence if anyone stepped out of line. All of this built up into what has to be one of their most effective and honestly effortless moneymakers, the no-show job. The process was brilliantly simple. First, they muscle control of a legitimate business, like the delivery trucks for the New York Post. Second, they assign a high-ranking mobster like Bonanno Captain Richard Contarella a salaried position with full health benefits. Third, the mobster literally never shows up for work. They just sit back and collect the paycheck. And finally, they demand a cut of any illicit activity like gambling or loan sharking that might be happening among the actual real workers on that site. Wise guys built massive wealth and expansive empires purely through intimidation, with zero actual labor. So after exploring the origins of omerta, the immense greed of the heroin trade, and the fatal, flashy hubris of bosses like Colombo and Gotti, we're left with a really provocative thought. Did law enforcement destroy the five families, or did the mafia ultimately destroy itself from the inside out? Now, the RICO Act with the FBI certainly supplied the handcuffs, for sure. But as we've explored today in this explainer, it was the mob's irresistible lure to the spotlight, their overwhelming greed, and their total inability to stick to their own secret code that truly brought the American Mafia to its knees. Thanks so much for joining me. Keep questioning the history behind the headlines, and I'll catch you next time.